Welcome to Principle of Charity. I'm Lloyd Vogelman and I'm here with my cousin and buddy Ondine Sherman. We're here to inject some generosity and curiosity back into our conversations. Principle of Charity tells us to seek the truth, not win the fight. In fact, we start the podcast asking each of our guests to present the most generous version of the other's viewpoint. Emil will then lead a conversation with the guest exploring what they really think. And later, I'll focus some more on the principle of charity itself. Our topic today is it moral to eat meat? Emil, tell us a little bit more.
Thanks, Lloyd. So, is it moral to eat meat? We humans have been eating meat pretty much since the dawn of our species, but the number of humans, the amount of meat we eat, and the way we raise these animals is nothing like the world of our ancestors, even those of 100 years ago. In 2018, according to the UN, worldwide an estimated 69 billion chickens, 1.5 billion pigs, and a few billion turkeys, goats, sheep, and cattle were killed for food, and over 1 trillion sea animals were killed as well for food. In the last 50 years, the number of people on the planet has doubled, but the amount of meat we eat has more than tripled. Now, most of this extra demand has come from middle income countries, particularly China, but the appetite for meat in Western countries remains huge. We know that agriculture in general, but in particular meat production, plays a big role in greenhouse gas emissions. And for a bunch of reasons, which we'll hopefully explore, eating meat seems to be one of the least efficient ways of converting energy from the world around us and bringing it into our bodies. So, how do all these animals live? In the US, it's estimated that 99% of farmed animals live in factory farms, and in Australia, it's 95%. Have we as a society sanctioned the way these animals are raised for our consumption? Do we even know exactly what goes on behind those closed walls? So, how are we to make sense morally with this incredibly complex topic of meat? We have the fundamental question of whether it's right to take a life that is sentient and conscious. But then there are the core questions of our evolution, our nature, our culture, and our taste buds, all powerful forces that drive most of us to eat meat. There are questions around diet and health, around climate change and pollution, and questions around the morality of more humane practices like free range farming and whether we can really feed the world's growing billions that way at an affordable price. But at the core of this are the sentient creatures, the animals whose experiences we are only starting to understand. We literally hold their lives in our hands. Have we fully reckoned with that responsibility? Who are we going to bring on? Who are our guests, Lloyd, to help us unpack all of this? And we know they've got different views on the topic.
Thanks, Emil. We've got two great guests today. We have Matthew Evans. Matthew Evans is a television presenter, famous food critic, and a prolific author. He has written an ethical meat manifesto called On Eating Meat. And Matthew has a pig farm and a mixed holding that grows food for his on-farm restaurant in Tasmania. Our other guest, you know well, is Ondine Sherman. Ondine is the co-founder and managing director of Voiceless, the Animal Protection Institute. Ondine is also an author. Her latest book is called Vegan Living, and she's also director of the conservation NGO This Is My Earth. Ondine will join us, Emil, from Tel Aviv today. And let me tell you a little bit more. Matthew and Ondine both care a lot about animals and the environment, but they have some very, very different views. Matthew, I know, has felt quite bullied by the vegan movement, and I know Ondine has some real issues with Matthew's conclusions and was quite tentative about coming on this podcast. We had to do a lot of arm twisting. And just finally, before we bring on the guests, I want to remind the audience that we will first be asking Matthew to present the most generous version of Ondine's viewpoint, and then vice versa. After that, we'll get into their real views. Let's bring on the guests. Matthew and Ondine, welcome to both of you. Matthew, I'll start with you. And where are you, by the way?
I'm at my farm in southern Tasmania. So just finished the day's cooking and farming. But thanks for having me, Lloyd, and thanks for asking.
Beautiful. What I have to ask you, what did you cook?
Well, we have a market garden. So we grow 70 species of annual vegetable and whatever's in season. So at the moment, it's actually what we call the hungry patch. So we're doing asparagus, the early broad beans, but hardly any of those. All our brassicas are pretty much finished. So we're pretty much surviving on polenta, kale, and late season broccoli.
Okay, good stuff. Ondine, where are you today?
I'm sitting in sunny Israel,
Mm-hmm.
on the other side of the world, but my brain and most other things are in Australia, as always, since I
Okay.
work remotely. And yeah, but thanks for having me on.
Lovely. Well, I first have to disclose here, as listeners may have guessed, that Ondine is in fact my sister. So I'm going to try my best not to be prejudiced against her, as people who have brothers and
I know
sisters
it
know.
works against me, that fact.
I'll start with Matthew then, just to ask you, Matthew, to go forth and present, the most generous version as you see it for the view that Ondine probably would ascribe.
I think Ondine's way of approaching the world is driven through kindness. So I think she sees fairness and kindness as driving principles behind everything that she does, and her veganism is an expression of that. So in everything that she is doing in her life, she likes to, I think, have a moral focus for that, and her diet is an area where she feels she can have a huge impact, and other people can have a huge impact, and hence her activism. And so I think she believes very firmly that that we exploit animals, that we shouldn't exploit animals, and one of the main ways you can influence change is to be an activist in the space and get people to stop consuming them, essentially stop killing them and stop abusing them and stop using them in, for the cosmetics industry, for medical testing and all sorts of things, but particularly to not eat them, because that's something that we're all involved in every day, is making choices about our diet.
Lovely, lovely. So at the core of it, that there's an immorality of eating animals, of killing animals.
Yes, yeah, I think she's very driven by the concept of kindness and being fair to not just to other humans, but to other species.
Lovely, lovely. Okay. Well, Ondine, how would you present the ethical omnivore viewpoint?
Firstly, thanks, Matthew. That was very nice summary. And I feel that that was, yeah, a good representation. I mean, what I thought I would do first, before I go into presenting his view, is just go through all the things we agree on, because there's actually so many things that we agree on, and things in common. I mean, I think what Matthew is saying in his book and his interviews and what I've read is that factory farming is terrible and it needs to stop. You know, animals suffer horribly in factory farming industries. You've got meat chickens and hens um, and feedlots and so on. And another big issue is the transparency of these big industries and how secretive and evasive they are, and how crucial transparency is. And I see that as being a really important kind of ethic for Matthew, with that, which I agree with 100%. And I think consumers should and must know, and have access to information. And it's actually, when we first started Voiceless, was our big phrase, is lifting the veil of secrecy, because transparency is key. We also agree, as Matthew says, that animals, need to express their normal behavior. I know he has, relationships with all the animals on his farm. They are sociable, intelligent, complex creatures, and they deserve to express themselves, and be, emotionally well and intellectually well. And that also, our primary aim should be, in a big picture, to like reduce the massive consumption of animals, which, is caused by these huge industries. 70 billion animals are killed every year around the world. And, Australia and the US are the biggest consumers of meat and animal products. So I think, that's a really important aim that we share. Another thing is that, strategies of using anger and guilt and judgment to try and convince people that you're right and they're wrong isn't helpful, and it isn't strategic. And I know Matthew's felt attacked by vegans in the past, and I apologize on behalf of everyone for this. I don't think it's helpful to be attacking each other, and having conversations is important. Just quickly, in terms of the environmental issues, I know that Matthew, has strong environmental concerns, and, you know, land clearing for cattle and feeding cows grain and feedlots and overgrazing are all huge environmental issues, and there's huge environmental costs. Um, every time that we grow or produce animals. And that, he believes that there should be more of a focus on wildlife killed during common agricultural practices, which I think is a great idea, because as he points out in his book, there's like millions and millions of wild animals killed, when we farm crops such as peas and so on. I mean, his summary, I guess, where his conclusion is where we disagree. But what he's saying is that given that people are unlikely to totally give up eating meat because it's so embedded in our culture and it tastes good and it's, pleasurable, let's focus on creating, humane, ethical animal industries, or farming, with small amounts, much smaller amounts of animals being killed, that obviously treat animals better. And that, he also believes that this kind of narrow focus, I guess, on veganism doesn't take into account, the huge amount of damage and killing that we do to animals in other parts of human activities, even flying or driving and so on.
Lovely. Lovely. Well, before you guys both get a chance to clarify and further expound your own views, Lloyd, our charity barometer, how do you think they both went?
You're putting me on the spot again. I'm gonna look. I'll start with Matthew. What I loved about Matthew's depiction was that he started with a value, and the value was that Ondine is driven by kindness and fairness. And I think one of the core dimensions of the principle of charity is the acknowledgement of intent, of good intent. And I think that came through. I suppose I'd be interested in, as we explore today, Matthew, just some of your understanding of some of the detail of Ondine's arguments would have been interesting to hear on that side. From Ondine's side, I thought, Ondine, you articulated brilliantly some of the arguments. I kept on waiting. There's a chapter, I think, in one of Matthew's books about vegans don't hurt animals, and it says, think again. And I thought, you're not going to mention that, and then you did. So I'm going to have to give you a very high score for the detail of how you articulated Matthew's arguments. What I also liked, and I think this is key, is why I'd give you a high score on the principle of charity, is one of the things about the principle of charity is finding areas that we agree on. Not just disagree on. And I think that is absolutely part of the DNA of the principle of charity. So I'm going to give them both high marks, but I'm going to give Ondine a very high mark.
Lovely. Okay. Well, great. Well, we'll get into the meat of the discussion, but I guess I just want to acknowledge that both
The tofu of the discussion, might I correct you?
You're trying to influence already, Ondine. We're going to edit that one out.
That's great. That's
You
great.
can't say that.
The tofu of the discussion, but that both Ondine and Matt have both thought deeply about the ethics of eating meat, and killing animals, and how to minimize suffering, and about what is morally permissible. And they both come to different conclusions. And that's what's exciting about getting you both on the podcast. Matthew, how would you present your view of our relationship with animals and why it is moral to eat meat in the end of the day?
Yeah, look, it's really fraught, I think, our relationship with animals, first and foremost. I don't think we understand our relationship with animals fully. I think we are very driven by the things that make us human. So we are driven by characteristics that remind us of ourselves. So soft eyes, warm blood, cuteness. We are much more aware of animals that we give human characteristics, or we can see some humanness in them. So our pets at home, cats and dogs, but also other warm-blooded animals, we're much more concerned about them than we are about slugs and lizards and that kind of thing. And so I think our relationship is fraught, and I think it's fraught for other reasons, that a lot of us feel guilty for if an animal suffers or dies, and we take that as though that suffering was happening to us or people around us. And so I think most modern people, in modern societies, in developed nations, have a very torn relationship with animals, because on the one hand they fetishize and they sort of put put them on a pedestal like they're pets, and on the other hand, they will eat something that comes from a farming system that, if they could see behind the closed gate, they would think was abhorrent. And they're very able to close off the bit that doesn't want to see what happens behind the closed gate when they choose to eat meat. So the best word I can think of is fraught.
So why don't we jump to you, Ondine, and ask you why you think it's essentially immoral to eat meat?
I mean, I think I want to start with a disclaimer that when I'm talking about the morality or ethics of eating meat, I'm talking about, let's start with Australia. As Matthew says, a developed and privileged country where we have access to supermarkets and food of all kinds. I'm not talking about a remote sub-Saharan village in Africa. Given that we're talking about Australia or the US or the UK and so on, I think, if you're talking about morality, killing animals for food, obviously causes them death. You're taking someone's life. And in addition to that, there's still a lot of suffering, even on, the best, most ethical farms. And part of the kind of industry of suffering for commercial killing of any animals is, we're talking about in Australia, there's 12 million male chicks still killed in the hen industry, and that's the free range hen industry included. And there's, 800,000 male bobby calves or, calves that are killed as waste products in the dairy industry. So you're still causing death and the suffering that goes along with that. For example, in the transportation of these animals to the slaughterhouse, bodily mutilation such as tail docking or castration without any pain relief, debeaking still happens. There's still like a huge amount of suffering that happens when you commercially and industrially slaughter large numbers of beings. Is it moral to do that when we can live healthy, happy lives with access to every kind of food and nutrition available that enables us to make a choice not to partake in those industries? The answer I'm saying is yes. Like, I don't think if we have a choice, of causing suffering and killing somebody versus not, if we can still live a healthy, happy life that way, there's no moral justification for it. If everybody will then go out and do it, there's obviously like lots and lots of obstacles in people's way, habits and cultures and so on. So I'm not talking about the behavior, but I'm talking about the moral principle of killing somebody and causing suffering to them needlessly, in fact.
So, Matthew, I mean, I take it that you don't agree with that, at the foundation, there are a lot of things we will get into in this conversation, but I want to start at the beginning, which is that you have an animal, a sentient being with a life that, we all acknowledge exists and has richness and has an experience of consciousness to it. And a core ethical principle would say that sentience gives rise to the right to exist and to not being killed. And if you kill a sentient being, you are breaching their rights to exist. Is that something, you disagree with on principle?
I don't disagree with it on principle, but I think it's very easy to oversimplify stuff. So if you talk about that sentient being, perhaps it's the cockatoo that I just saw dead hanging from my mate's a post in my mate's orchard because it's eating the fruit that they grow, and the only way they can protect their orchard is by killing that animal. Yeah, maybe it's not a great thing to have killed that animal, but animals die all the time, and the thing with taking a sentient being's life for food is not something that you should single out the meat industry for, because like on our farm, we kill more animals growing we grow 70 species of annual vegetable. We grow 30 species of perennial plants. The majority of our what we serve on the farm and we eat is grown in the garden, but we kill way, way, way more animals in the garden than we do on the rest of the farm put together. And some of those are warm-blooded, and some of them are what you would classify as sentient, and some of them are not. Some of them are, maybe wouldn't be classified as sentient, and things like slugs and snails and that sort of thing. But a lot of them are. And I think there's this misconception that when you're growing food, you're competing with everything else that wants to eat it. And so it's very hard to grow food and not kill something else that wants to eat it, whether that be a grasshopper, a lizard, a slug, a deer, a kangaroo, or something else. So the actual taking of a life to put it on the plate, to have a nutrient-dense food, high quality protein and heme iron and all that kind of stuff, is just one life among the many lives that we take to be able to grow food and get it on the tables of Australians. So there's a lot of focus on the livestock industry and worry about those lives, but there's not a lot of care for the other lives that the things that die to grow all food.
Right. Well, I think that's really clearly espoused, and you want to take that focus away from the narrow lens on the animals that are killed under our protection into the ecosystem as a whole and the animals that are killed across that. Ondine, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I find that logic curious. I don't understand the logic. I mean, to summarize what I hear Matthew say and what I've read in his book, what he's saying is that, factory farming is bad, agreed. However, we kill animals in other ways, such as when we eat peanut butter, we're killing insects. So therefore, everything we do has an impact. So let's throw up our hands, and it's all too hard, so we may as well eat animals too, but let's do it humanely. I mean, my logic is that factory farming is bad. Yes, we kill animals in other ways, insects in our peanut butter. But let's try and address those issues too. This isn't a zero-sum game. This isn't like two wrongs make a right. Let's look at insect-free peanut butter and predator-friendly farming and not killing cockatoos on, trees and, wildlife crossings over highways and better window designs so, birds don't get killed by windows. I mean, all these kind of things that Matthew's brought up. And let's work towards veganism, which is clearly like a goal that is looking to protect animals in the most holistic way. So by kind of saying, well, we kill animals other ways, so we may as well, that just isn't, I don't find it like a logical progression. I mean, also I would argue that one is manslaughter and the other one is murder, if we compared it with humans. I mean, to use an example, someone can go into a public park and put a bomb there, and the chances of them killing someone might be the same as someone driving on a windy road when it's raining. I mean, the person who has planted the bomb would be convicted of murder, and the person who might accidentally hit someone on the road, that would be manslaughter. So
That's a key point, Ondine. I did want to ask you about this, Matthew, because you broaden the frame so that animals under our care or the care of the farmer, let's say, and if you have a cow and you're breeding cows or pigs, that particular relationship that a farmer has with the animal where it's under its care, you're treating the same essentially as the inadvertent deaths that are likely to be caused by things like pesticides from animals that are not under one's care. Do you think that it is morally equivalent, that an animal that one kills oneself for meat is the same as the animal who comes across the pesticides and dies because you put pesticides on to protect crops?
Probably not with things like pesticides, but if you frame it this way, and I'm a little bit surprised that Ondine's. Well, I guess she sees. She probably she talks about murder and manslaughter, and it's often where the debate ends up, because I don't think killing a non-human animal as murder, but just to put it in context for
I'm
Ondine.
just making the moral equivalent.
Yeah, I know.
Like
But vegans do it all the time. And I think non-vegans often say, well, it's all about attachment. And very few of us would compare the attachment to another human to be the same as the attachment to a swallow or to a cow, or and to say that is murder. I think a lot of people would reject that. But just to frame it in a sense that you might,
I mean, intentional versus accidental,
as
a byproduct.
Yeah. So just to frame it, okay. So So around me, we're an orchard region. So when I drive past the cherry farm up the road and I see him moving his traps out of the orchard in the morning, what he has done is he's trapped possums, and he has looked them in the eye, chosen the victim, okay, taken his gun out and blown their brains out, knowing that that is the victim of his actions to grow cherries at the price that people are willing to pay. And that is done all when people are shooting the lorikeets or the cockatoos that are eating the pistachios or the almonds. They're choosing a victim. It's yes, pesticides is more broad, possibly more harmful in the ecological sense, but it's not all just as you might put it, murder or or not. It's
So killing the lorikeet or the bird who's eating the pistachio is essentially the same in your view as killing the cow to eat the cow.
it's choosing a victim. It's not. Oh my God, what an accident! I fired my gun and something died. It's I've got that cockatoo, I've got that possum, I've got that deer, I've got that wallaby, I've got that whatever it is in my sights, and I shoot it.
Ondine, you'd say there's a subtle but meaningful distinction, or that's the same?
I mean, I acknowledge what Matthew's saying, and I think it's a really important point. I guess what frustrates me and what I think is a real pity, because when I've heard Matthew kind of talk about this subject, it feels like the kind of output of his message, of this message that he's kind of communicating, like undermines veganism or undermines, the goals of veganism. Whereas I would think that, I mean, I can hear that Matthew's really passionate about these issues, like looking at possums being killed in cherry farming, for example. And that is like a really important issue. Like, wouldn't it be better to say, well, veganism's a noble goal. Let's like try and get towards that kind of world. And at the same time, like, let's address some of these horrific things that are going on in farming that are causing mass death of wildlife as well. Like, I just find it frustrating that the two are working against each other instead of a parallel goal of like, let's try and stop all animal abuse as much as we can.
In thinking about this difference that you both come to this core question of the morality of eating meat, I came up with a theory. I want to run it by you both. That in a way, you're both ending the statement, it's immoral to eat meat, with different second halves. Ondine is saying it's immoral to eat meat, and it may also be immoral to eat crops in the way we produce them today. So let's not eat meat, but also do better with crops. And Matthew, you're assuming the statement says it's immoral to eat meat, but moral to eat crops. And that's what irks you with some of veganism's views, as they're sort of putting crops on this high moral threshold, high moral level, but saying meat is immoral. And you're saying, no, it's not true that it's immoral to eat meat, but moral to eat crops.
I don't think it's immoral to eat meat because I see ecosystems as whole things, and that animals exist within ecosystems. We exist within ecosystems. You take animals out of ecosystems and they collapse. And so, in some places, at some time, I think it's okay to eat meat because that's what the ecosystem needs, what it demands, and what works well in that area. I really don't care if people are vegan or not. I think actually it's up to each individual to decide whether it's moral or not to eat meat. But they should use a wide range of sources to make that value judgment. And I've decided for me that it's moral to eat meat, and Ondine's decided for her it's not moral. The difference is she wants everybody to stop eating meat, and I really don't care because I think you're all grown-ups and you can make your own decisions.
I don't think if you look back in history and you look back in the rise of social justice movements and so on, that you can say that, the big issues about justice and, oppression are personal choices. You look at this anti-slavery movement, at the end of that, you didn't say, well, having a slave is my personal choice, or beating my wife is my personal choice. Or, when your personal choices have victims who are suffering, as in the case of animals today, I think it's a political choice and it's a political discussion. And the community can set expectations, but the community needs to be informed and they need to be educated. And at the moment, with these huge multinational industries, you've got like David and Goliath. You've got little groups like Voiceless, comparing with multi-billion-dollar industries, pushing their messages through. So I don't think you can say we have a well-informed, educated public on these issues in order to make these kind of decisions. So yeah, I really I don't accept that it's a personal choice.
Okay, well, just on that.
On that point. Yeah.
Yeah, so, well, just on that, I mean, so you're making equivalence between humans. Yeah, we talk about slavery; it's a common
But that's
theme
all
with
we
these
can
sort of
make
arguments.
equivalence to. We have no other,
So,
there's no other equivalence. Like, I'm not saying it's the same. I'm just saying it's the only examples we can use because we don't have any other examples except humans.
sure, but okay, I guess that comes down to speciesism, or considering ourselves, uh, above other species or are able to exploit other species. And I guess I would wonder at which point which point down the branches of life you want to go, because all of life is a continuum. So there's bacteria, there's protists, nematodes. There are billions and billions of living things in the world. And at which point do we go, you know what? Every time I eat an apple, I've killed, 2 billion bacteria or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, this
You have to have
argument
a point.
is very questionable because I mean we can work on is the current scientific knowledge that we have. And the current scientific knowledge we have, and it's been endorsed, and there's the Cambridge Declaration of Sentience where the world's best scientists have come together and said, this is the line. These animals are sentient and, these aren't. So let's work with that. If we find out that apples are sentient and are crying and screaming each time we eat them, like, we'll address it then, you know.
This is probably a good point to ask you, Matthew, because a lot of listeners won't really know, putting aside some of the micro moral questions we're discussing, just what does happen in industrial animal production. What part of the process do you find immoral? Speaking for yourself personally, where do you draw the line personally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. From my perspective, it is all about the life. So it's allowing an animal to express its instinct. So if a chicken wants to dust bathe, it has access to dust. If a pig wants to wallow, it has access to a muddy bath. If a pig wants to nest, or if a cow wants to eat grass and lie in the shade, if it wants to socialise, it should be allowed to do those things.
So that means, Matthew, that because by far the majority, I think a statistic I saw was 95% of Australian animals are reared in factory farms, to sort of bring back to the common ground between you and Ondine, you have a moral problem with 95% of the way animals' lives are lived in Australia.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, I there's no doubt about it. We eat too much meat, and we eat way too much badly produced meat that hasn't considered the animal, the environment, or the farmer. The people who are there's a toll on the people who have to look after those animals as well, I think.
So what are the lives like of these animals behind the factory farm walls? What do you know of how they live? Because there is such a veil of secrecy, and it's so hard to get in because of the protection of the big corporations.
Yeah, look, I think Ondine would probably know better than me, because I refused to break into the farms, because we were on a farm, and we know that someone breaking into our farm would feel it's essentially like having your house breaking into. So we didn't want to do that. So I tried knocking on the front door. I'm a meat eater. I've told them, I just want to see how animals are raised. Pretty much closed door unless they're sort of higher ethical standards, higher welfare animals. But look, your average, it's about 30% of pigs in Australia, mother pigs in Australia, sows, still live in what's called a sow stall. So it's essentially a bathtub-sized cage. It's made out of metal bars. She can only lie or stand up. She can't turn around. She can't walk anywhere. She's got to have at least 1 centimetre gap at the front and back and to the side, so she's not touching the bars at all times. And then when she's not in that, she goes to a farrowing crate, which is exactly the same thing, but with a little space at the side where she can have her babies when they farrow, give birth. They go into a farrowing crate for a few weeks. So I think about 30% of Australian pigs are still in something like that. This is not, even though they've bred pigs to be, emotionally able to cope with this is not something an animal is mentally, emotionally designed for or hardwired for. And I think it's a sad indictment on the industry in Australia, and a sad indictment on Australians that they haven't cared enough to change that.
I just wanted to address his language when he says breaking in, because I think that's really important. These industrial farms or factory farms, I don't think it's fair to say activists. I don't actually call myself an activist. I'm an advocate because I'm not out there, doing grassroots action. I'm doing, advocacy in other ways. But that aside, I don't think it's the right language to say that they're breaking in, given the context. I mean, and the context is that there are no cameras in these places, so nobody from the outside can see what's happening. There's a closed door policy. The Ministry of Agriculture regulates, is meant to regulate what's happening in these farms, and that's a conflict of interest because they are also meant to increase the profits of the farms. So they have no motivation or reverse motivation to actually stop any cruelty that's happening. The only ways that we know any of the terrible things that happen inside these farms is through footage and photographs that activists have taken. So until there's an independent Office of Animal Welfare, until there's CCTV cameras in these places, I don't think the words breaking in are fair, because these, as Matthew agrees with me, these are animals' lives. They shouldn't be treated terribly and cruelly, and so leaving them in a closed door system with the only control and no independent oversight is with the people who profit from them isn't okay.
This is what you want, isn't it, Matthew? You want there to be transparency, and you said something interesting in your book, I think, about society hasn't really sanctioned what goes on behind those doors, and that feels like too big an amount of things that are going on behind closed doors for society not to have the opportunity to truly know about it and sanction it.
Yeah, it's exactly the problem. If what sort of farmer is doing something they're not proud to show Australians, and what is happening behind the doors, and I'm sorry you took offence at that breaking in, but I mean I do consider it breaking in. But I think what animal activists do is actually super valuable in that they bring these things to light. But I do feel that that I couldn't do that kind of thing when I'm trying to be respectful of the farmers and trying to do it in a way that doesn't make them feel at risk, because a lot
Yeah,
of
they're
these
competing ethics there. They're competing ethics, aren't they?
yeah
Yeah.
these are human beings. I've met some of them who are totally traumatized after people have come
Mm.
in, and this is a very weird thing for people to do, to make a human being feel threatened and vulnerable, when when we're talking kindness, when we're talking generosity, when we're talking you need to be fair. It's not. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to make other human beings feel
Well,
vulnerable.
why don't we move? But first, a statistic that I think has really surprised me and Lloyd when we've spoken about, I think a lot of people, is not that there are a couple of percent or a few percent who are vegan. It's just how many people have been vegan or vegetarian in their life. I saw a statistic that in the US, 84% of the people who've been vegetarian or vegan go back to eating meat. So I want to ask you, Ondine, and then we'll get to you, Matthew. Do you acknowledge, Ondine, that there is a very strong evolutionary and nature pull to eat meat? Because if there wasn't, how do we explain how bloody hard it is?
I mean, it's bloody hard because our society and our cultural norms and our childhood upbringing and our friends and family make it bloody hard. And also because, unfortunately, there's this what did I heard this term the other day, like a toxic moral perfectionism that reigns in some of the vegan community. That's if you eat a single spoon of honey in a year, they will chuck you out of the vegan label and you're no longer a vegan. So I would be interested with that study and those statistics, to dig down and see how much, even if they're not labeling themselves as vegan or vegetarian anymore, like how much they cut back. Because I would say that to be vegan, I would say like 80% vegan is vegan, or vegan enough. So
Do you
it's,
think there's a pull? Do you think there's a biological pull towards eating meat?
look, I honestly don't care. I mean, there's probably a biological pull to us killing people. I mean, there's a number of people I could probably just murder today because they make me angry. I mean, I think we're, like, let's consider ourselves a little bit more elevated than just like our biological pulls. We have biological pulls all day, every day that we say, thanks, but no thanks. And in this particular case, given that all the studies have shown that veganism is a healthy lifestyle and that you can, have all your nutritional needs met, and there is countless amounts of delicious, wonderful vegan food. I think people need to honestly get over themselves.
I think your second point is the key one, and I think you don't. I would suggest that you don't need to be scared of acknowledging which maybe you don't feel the pull to meat, and I have, and I've gone from being a pescatarian to a reducitarian
Mm.
because of that pull. I think we can acknowledge the pull, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Matthew. At the same time as saying just because we have a pull towards something doesn't mean we don't need to use our ethical and moral and rational brains to make decisions around it. What do you think, Matthew? Is this at the core actually of your views that we're a species that eats meat and we should get on with it ethically?
Yeah, look, it's more multifaceted than that, but yeah, that's part of it. I'm actually stoked because about 80% of my diet or more would be vegan, so I classify as vegan. And
I am
You've been
anointing
playing.
you.
it's fantastic. It's great. It's absolutely brilliant.
Okay,
Thank you.
85. Let's say 85.
Come on, bit of charity.
Geez, Ondine, you're tough, eh?
Of course.
But look, I have to say, we eat predominantly vegetables, but we try to eat what we grow, and we don't produce oil on the farm. So we produce butter and we produce animal fats. We try to cook with those quite often, but actual meat in our meals is actually not a huge part of our diet. But there are times, and I think this is really interesting, that we will sit and eat say a piece of steak or something it'd be very quite rare that we would do that. Not rare for a lot of people, but for us every 3-4 months, and we get unbridled pleasure from it. We get embarrassed by how much joy we get from it, and so my partner and I do feel there is a pull, a draw to it because it makes us feel very different from even the most amazing meals that we've made without meat. Do you need that? No. Can we change? Yeah, we can change. But what I'm really interested in is a lot of people are meat eaters because of historical reasons, cultural reasons, societal pressure, ease. Like most of the vegetables you buy in shops taste like rubbish compared to what you can grow yourself. So if I had to eat a shop bought carrot, I'd be eating more meat because sadly, some of the meat you can buy, even rubbish meat, is more satisfying than some of the rubbish vegetables, which is a real indictment on the modern food production system. But the other thing is, not every bit of land is good for growing vegetables. And in fact, just about everywhere in Australia where you grow crops, where you grow grain, where you grow pulses, where you grow vegetables, they've lost half their carbon since white people arrived. And just about everywhere they recommend this, it's in America, in Africa, in Australia, even in Europe, where you've lost carbon in soil, the best thing you can do is turn it back into grass. More than half the world's carbohydrate is cellulose. You and I can't digest it. Ruminants can. We have the opportunity to use land that we couldn't use otherwise to grow food for us. We can't digest cellulose, but we can digest the milk and meat that come from animals that can digest cellulose. So I see it in very broad brushstrokes that, some people, sometimes it might be a good idea to eat meat. A whole bunch of people, maybe not. That's for them to decide. And but if you want to grow the most food, sometimes using an animal is an okay thing to do to get the most food from a piece of land, depending on your geography, your climate.
Yeah, I need to ask you this question because it comes up quite a lot. A lot of animals owe their very existence to the fact that people want to eat meat. That they wouldn't exist without the fact that people want to eat meat. And so, it's the sort of standard argument that if it wasn't for meat eaters, these animals wouldn't have a life. And in fact, they may have a very good life for a long period of time if they end up on Matthew's farm rather than in a factory farm. What's your view on that perspective?
I don't agree with that perspective. I mean, I know I keep making equivalents to humans, but this is just my way of shedding a light on some of these tricky issues by us thinking about it in a different way. I mean, it would be like a futuristic movie where we're breeding children so they can work, in factories and down mines. And then, future generations saying, oh, but all those children won't exist if we don't breed them for
Or
them.
for their organs, that's probably the
Or for,
easiest one, where they
yeah,
need
okay, for
need
their
healthy happy.
organs. I mean,
It's the Kazuo Ishiguro book and movie where, the kids realize at some point they're having this great time at school and having fun and parties, and they
It's
realize at
coming
a
to
certain
an
point.
end. Yeah, I don't want to paint this as just the factory farm situation. I'm painting where these animals are actually having a good experience, and then that comes to an end. I mean, in one sense, Matthew is arguing, there's always a beginning and an end. Animals are largely determined by choices that humans make in many ways, literally even in parks, wild parks, game reserves. The fact is they have an opportunity to actually exist because humans have these game parks. I mean, what's your view on animals having a long period of very good experiences, but and then that life comes to an end?
I mean, I think that, firstly, there's a practical reality, which is that's just not the case for the vast majority of animals in these systems. As Emil noted, 95% are in factory farms. But if you're talking about just like a hypothetical question, I mean, you can look at dog breeding, for example. Maybe that's a better equivalent. Like we breed our, chihuahuas and pugs, and they, mostly have a pretty good lives in people's houses. Is it morally, okay to breed dogs for our, pleasure and so on? And I honestly don't think that there's one clear answer. I think, every case needs to be addressed individually. I mean, dogs might be one thing. In certain species of dogs, there's arguments about, dogs that are bred, for a certain look that are suffering with their nasal passages not working properly, or they get, all these kind of problems. The same with farm animals, like the broiler chickens for the meat industry are bred, to have such large breast meat that they, become crippled and can't walk and have problems breathing and so on. So I think there's no one answer. I think we shouldn't be breeding animals in mass quantities in order to exploit and use them for our purposes, when it means, suffering, pain, and death. Um, but there might be exceptions to that depending.
Can I move the conversation to probably the key practical question as far as I'm concerned? We're looking at the common ground between you. You both agree that factory farming is immoral. If we go, Matthew, to the more ethically reared animals, essentially your farm, and how extraordinary the lives of those animals are until they're ended, can we feed the world meat based on that system of farming?
Yeah, undoubtedly we can feed the world meat. We just can't feed them gobs of meat like Australians eat and Americans eat. Yeah, because well, animals. You got to look at each individual animal, but we've domesticated a few. Pigs are essentially recyclers. They turn stuff we can't, don't, won't eat into something we can eat. Cows, sheep, goats turn cellulose, something we can't eat, into something we can eat. 95% of the world's soy is turned into oil for human consumption, and we feed the soy pulp, which is worth less per, it's worth more overall, because you only get a small amount of oil from soy, but it's worth less as a proportion. We feed the waste essentially from the oil production to the cows. Now, I had the numbers earlier today. We throw away or use in industry thousands of tons of cow fat every year is thrown away because people don't want to eat animal fat anymore. And then we feed cows, some in feedlots, probably soy protein, and we consume the vegetable oil. Anytime you see vegetable oil on a product, it's either palm oil or soy oil, and they are both environmental catastrophes. And so there's a cost that we're not even seeing. But the good thing about animals, when you grow wheat, when you grow barley, when you grow all these things, we can only eat the tiny, tiny little seeds off the top, but something can eat the bottom and turn that into human grade food. And it would be a waste of our resources to not use the things we are gifted by nature to their best advantage. And sometimes, not all the time, and certainly not in massive quantities, putting something through an animal to turn it into human quality food is a really, really good use of the world's resources.
You think that there are efficiencies to be gained, essentially, that with mixed farming, there's a role for animals right through the cycle to be able to get the maximum out of our soil in a sustainable environmental way.
Yeah. Look. Soils don't exist without animals. Like when humans have managed landscapes, whether it's in Australia through fire stick farming or in Europe through managed ecosystems. We have managed landscapes for millennia. The Amazon, the most fertile parts of the Amazon are where they created terra preta, the fertile earths, by composting lots of waste, including animal waste and charcoal. And we created these amazing fertile oases within the Amazon rainforest, because most of it's actually not very fertile. Animals have been part of ecosystems. They cycle nutrients. They're a really important part of ecosystems. Now, you can use wild animals. You can hope that birds and rats and mice and lizards and bats fly over your paddocks and spread the fertility that has always been spread over our landscapes. Or you can use managed animals, livestock, to keep things productive. But yes, definitely there are efficiencies to be had, and animals in some ecosystems that sometimes managed in the right way are not strangers to landscapes and can actually improve the productivity to create human grade food.
So when we think about equity and access to meat at reasonable prices, you sort of think there is a way economically for meat to be incorporated, less meat than we eat in the developed world, probably at increased prices, but essentially a sustainable way that in which animals are humanely raised, and it can sort of make sense, and the world can still get some meat, but not as much as they get now.
Yeah, definitely. Look, it would take 1.6 Earths for everyone in the world to eat like Australia does, because we eat so much meat, but also because we eat so much processed food. We don't have 1.6 Earths. So Australia, like a lot of other countries, will have to reduce their impact on the environment, and that can be a lot of that can be by reduced meat consumption. But taking animals out of the equation just creates more waste in lots of cases.
Let me bring this to Ondine for a second. I mean, putting the ethics of taking a life aside, do you agree, or have you looked at the question of whether animals are actually a helpful part of biodiversity and the regeneration of land?
I mean, like I mentioned, I did my Masters of Environmental Studies and looked at a lot of the degradation caused by hard-hoofed animals in Australia. So, I don't really see how that's having cattle and sheep is helpful if we're talking about the environment. These areas that Matthew's identified that don't have any other like use for us, so therefore we may as well, let livestock be on them and then use, they eat the grass and then we eat them and so on. It's these areas can be rewilded, and Australia's like depleted, it's like stripped the country of its like species and biodiversity and natural spaces. Let's leave these areas alone and let the native animals and return to the richness that it used to be. And I guess in terms of the future, I wanted to point out that there's a huge amount of food technology developing. And I place a lot of faith in that. I know Matthew in his book has said that he sees that it's kind of a soulless product that provides little joy and doesn't add to our cultural fabric. But I would say that, we can say the same about farming animals for meat. I don't think it adds
Mm.
much to our social fabric either. Um, and that and food technology, which will mean that, I mean, even today, or the tests they've done with meat eaters, um that who can't distinguish between a plant-based burger and a meat burger, and you can make it nutritious and healthy, and it has, from the studies, shown that it has like 100 times less impact on the land, and it uses way less water and so on. I mean, I think that is the solution for our world population. We've got like what 7 8 8 billion people. It's skyrocketing still. If we cut back 95% of our farming because we're no longer okay with doing, cruel, unethical farming, then we're going to need to supplement our diet with, with other foods. And not everybody can live on a beautiful kind of idyllic farm and have acreage and land and grow their own vegetables. People are in skyrise buildings in urban cities, and we need to have other technologies that can feed the population. And I think there are solutions.
Key to this podcast is the principle of charity. And I'm wondering whether both of you, often when you bring people together who have disparate views, rather than creating a more common view, sometimes in the argument, people actually have become more extreme in their views, meaning they're now even more clear that let's take Ondine's view that in fact veganism is even the thing to do. Now that I've had this conversation with Matthew, and I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Matthew, first, and then go to Ondine. Is there anything today that has softened or changed your view that you've heard, or in fact, has your view become even clearer and more hardened as a result of this conversation with Ondine?
In a way, I was hoping for some new arguments, I guess, and some new insights. And I don't feel that I got a lot of those. The thing is, from my perspective, if people want to become vegan, if the world wants to become vegan, great, good and well. It makes no difference to me. And I think actually, in lots of ways, that would be a really good thing. But I guess I don't feel that I need to become vegan. Haven't had the conversation. My wife and I have often said, if we didn't have access to good food, we probably would be vegan most of the time. But you need to have time, and you need to have money. Pretty much, and we're lucky enough to have to be able to grow our own food. So I don't think I felt convinced, but I don't feel any worse. I mean, what I really liked is that oftentimes I get vegan-splained where facts and figures are brought in that just don't seem to have any relevance to the argument. And I was really pleased that Ondine really stuck to to her argument and was really logical about the way she wanted to approach it. So from that perspective, it's really nice to have this conversation, because this is a conversation I love to have. We get vegans work with us.
Did you feel now that Ondine represented some of the strong points of your view rather than the weak points? Because it sounds like you've been in lots of conversations with vegans where you've either felt that they've got the high moral ground, or that there's data that is slightly misrepresentative or not clear.
No, I think she really nailed it. I think it was really good. And I think what's really nice is, I always get to be brought out as a spokesperson for meat. And I don't want anyone to eat more meat than they do, and probably eat less. And it's sort of weird that I always get sort of put as the opposite of a vegan, when actually, and I think Ondine recognised this very early on, we have 98% of things in common, and we differ at the death of the animal. I think that's the only place that we probably really substantially differ, is that I believe it's okay to use an animal for meat, and she doesn't.
So Matthew, last question. I mean, there are a lot of presumptions, it seems, that we all make around animals that can't be validated. How much they feel, whether they actually would want a good life and trade 15 years of a good life and then go to the abattoir or not. I mean, we're making tons and tons of assumptions exactly about how they feel. But if I suggested to you that Ondine could provide some evidence around veganism that would persuade you to move from 80% to 95%, and in fact not have any pigs on your farm, what would that evidence be? What would she need to demonstrate?
Yeah, look, I guess what she'd need to demonstrate is that even within a system that allows them to express their instincts, where they're self-managing, that they're doing what a pig wants to do, that they were still traumatized by the experience, that it was a day-to-day traumatic experience for them, and that their life was not good. If their life was not good, then we shouldn't bring them into the world.
Okay, thank you. Ondine, question for you. How charitable do you think you've been in this conversation?
I mean, I think I'm open to listening, and there's Definitely things, points that Matthew's brought up, when he told the story about the cherry farmer and the possums. Now I want to go start a campaign to save possums. Like, it doesn't change my mind. It like just adds more compelling things to my to-do list. So, I think there are those conversations that don't happen in the vegan community that Matt's identified around, the animal victims of farming. That should also be something that we note.
Was there anything in Matthew's book or any of the literature when you looked at Matthew's writings that has put a question in your mind or said, I need to reconsider my view, not change it, but at least reconsider it?
No, I can't. I just felt disappointed at his conclusion, to be honest, because he was, he's so passionate about the suffering of animals, and it did so much research, and I really admire, all the work that he did in his,
So you
journalistic
felt
work.
disappointed that he didn't agree with you?
I felt disappointed by this. What I identified before is what I felt like the logic, like rather than two wrongs don't make a right. Let's add to the conversation. Let's not undermine the one. But I think, and I don't mean to be rude, but it's hard when Matthew and his family have a pig farm, and they're it's very hard to change one's opinions and be open when your salary, your lifestyle comes from the activity that someone's trying to tell you is concerning.
Well, doesn't yours, Ondine?
Why?
Well, your life and work and everything is based on being vegan in the same way.
Yeah, if I suddenly started eating meat, my career would be over.
Yeah.
That's true. So I guess, yeah, I take that point. I mean, I watched this film. It's an American-based film about a free-range pig farmer. Just to Matt's point about, like, is there any information that would change his mind? It's a film called The Last Pig, and it's about, this lovely pig farmer in the US, and his relationship with his pigs, and his kind of slow kind of awakening to just the sentience of the pigs and the taking of the life. So those pigs were living like wonderful lives, as I'm sure Matthew's pigs are living. But it's just for him, and he decided to end his pig farming and go into other farming, hopefully farming that doesn't kill anybody. Because he was, he had these moments of looking into the eyes of his pigs, just realizing he was kind of needlessly taking their lives, and eventually feeling that wasn't a choice he wanted to make anymore.
I do think that the good news is that you are aligned on 97, 98% of things, and really the world that you both envisage is incredibly similar. And the particular good news, as you've seen, Matthew, is you've been newly anointed as a vegan. You're now part of the club.
I'm in.
You're in. So wonderful. So before we go, so just thank you so much to both of you. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and it's great that we've been able to focus on some core parts rather than make it too broad. Is there, Ondine, you've got a new book out. Do you want to say a couple of words about that and where people could find you on social media?
Yeah, I would love people to check out my book, because it's really for the vegan curious, and it's for reduction. It doesn't have a purist, perfectionist tone, because that's not what I believe is helpful. So I think it's actually quite aligned with Matthew's beliefs, except for a few small little points.
Yeah, Ondine's book's great. I really enjoyed it. Look, I think what I loved about reading Ondine's book is that it's for people who are curious, and it was, I guess, through that I saw most of her kindness and how she frames the world through this beautiful prism.
Well, thanks to both of you.
And
And
can I
Lloyd and
return
I,
the compliment to Matthew and just say, like, if everybody was as thoughtful and mindful and, contemplative about these issues, we would be in a totally different situation than we are. So I appreciate, his, the amount of thought and research and everything that he's put into this whole area. And his book is fascinating as well.
thank you so much to both of you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Emil.
Thank
Lloyd.
you.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you to our producer, Jonah Vogelman, and Emil, thank you.